please pause the video and try this question on your own before we take a look at it together. Okay, we're asked, what is the product of the positive integers a and b? This is a data sophisticated question, so we're given two statements. Statement number one says the greatest common factor of a and b is 15. A good way to see whether this statement is sufficient is to work with some numbers, test some numbers out, and see if that's going to give us enough info to find the product of a and b. So I'll make a quick column a, b, and a times b. The fact that the greatest common factor of a and b is 15 tells us a couple of things. The first one is that 15 is a factor of a because it's a common factor of a and b. So that means that 15 is equal to a times something else, and similarly b is also equal to 15 times something else. So in other words, 15 is a common factor of a and b, and the fact that it's the greatest common factor means that there's no other factors that a and b share. So for example, a could be 15 times 2, and b could be 15 times 3, or a could be 15 times 3, and b could be 15 times 4. So in both of these instances, in 15 times 2 for a and 15 times 3 for b, their greatest common factor is 15. The factor they share is 15, and they share no other factors. And similarly here, when a is 15 times 3 and b is 15 times 4, a and b share 15 and no other factors. And so if a is 15 times 2 or 30, and b is 15 times 3 or 45, then a times b is 15 times 2 times 15 times 3, which is going to be 30 times 450, which is some big number. And 15 times, in this case, it's going to be 15 times 3 times 15 times 4. This works out to be 225 times 6, and this is 225 times 12, so clearly different numbers. I'm not going to work out in my head. Therefore, statement number one is not sufficient. In fact, we can get a and b to be any two sets of numbers we want, as long as they both share a common factor of 15 and no other factor. So because of that, we don't know what the product of a and b is. It could be an infinite number of things. Statement number two tells us that the least common multiple of a and b is 30. So again, let's test some numbers out. What we're looking for is two numbers whose least common multiple is 30. And this is a little bit more difficult to just pick some numbers that fit. However, if you're told the least common multiple of two numbers, and you want to find those two numbers, or you want to come up with some numbers that are going to give you that least common multiple, a good strategy is just to pick the least common multiple itself. Because if a is 30 and b is 30, their least common multiple has to be 30. The least common multiple of 30 and 30 is 30. In fact, if one of the numbers is 30 itself, then the other number can be any factor of 30. So 30 and 5 gives us, for example, a least common multiple of 30. 30 and 10 give us a least common multiple of 30, and so on. In this case, the math is a little bit easier. So a times b is going to be 900 here. Here it's going to be 150. Here it's going to be 300. So there's, in fact, we can come up with a bunch of different other pairs of numbers whose least common multiple is 30. And once again, the product of a and b is not known. It can be a bunch of different things. So statement 2 on its own as well is not sufficient. And now we look at the two statements combined. Again, we're being asked what's the product of a and b, but now we know that the greatest common factor is 15 and that the least common multiple is 30. Instead of picking numbers, which is going to be a little bit cumbersome here and difficult to do, what we can do is remember a neat little shortcut, and that shortcut is the following. The least common multiple of two numbers times the greatest common factor of two numbers always equals the product of those two numbers. So in this case, we know that the least common multiple is 30. We know that the greatest common factor is 15. Because we know the least common multiple and the greatest common factor, we can multiply those, and the product of the least common multiple and greatest common factor of two numbers is equal to the product of the two numbers. And so the two statements together are sufficient to answer the question, and the answer is C, where both statements combined give us enough information. So to recap, this is a handy shortcut to remember when you're dealing with least common multiple and greatest common factor questions, especially when you're asked to combine them.